Chapter 23, World War I, Section 2, Americans Prepare for War. Most Americans on the onset of World War I viewed this war as a European conflict. They had nothing to do with them. They were staying neutral. Now, however, there are millions of Americans in the United States who are immigrants or children of immigrants, and many of them came from the countries who are fighting in World War I, and they tended to sympathize with their former countries. However, again, it was viewed as a European conflict, not an American conflict. America continued trading with European nations, mainly Great Britain and France, carrying supplies and war materials to the Allies. Like we said in the last section, Germany used U-boats to try and stop supply lines, oftentimes attacking ships without warning. In May of 1915, a German U-boat sank a British passenger liner called the Lusitania that killed over 1,200 people, and that included 128 Americans. The sinking of the Lusitania really fueled anti-German feelings in the United States. German Americans really started to become afraid in the United States, feeling that they would be attacked because of their German background. In March of 1960, a U-boat attacked a French passenger ship called the Sussex. Again, more Americans, about 80 of them, were casualties of the sinking of the Sussex. German leaders responded to this by agreeing not to attack merchant ships anymore without warning. That was one of the main things, is that these ships were not warned ahead of time before the Germans attacked. So they said they would not attack any ship without warning, and this became known as the Sussex Pledge. Now, Woodrow Wilson will run for re-election in 1916, and he will win largely due to the fact that he promised to remain neutral in the war. About a year after the Sussex Pledge, however, the Germans will start to attack ships again without warning, including American vessels. And so President Wilson will break off diplomatic relations with Germany in February of 1917. Now, the United States will step closer to war in March of 1917, when the United States will intercept a note that was being sent to Mexico called the Zimmerman Note. It's named after a German foreign minister to Mexico called Arthur Zimmerman, and this note essentially said that if Mexico would side with Germany, that Germany would help them recapture the lands that they lost to the United States in the Mexican War. And so this note was obviously caught and decoded, and it was plastered all over newspapers in the United States, and so the public started to become more outraged with Germany. In April of 1917, that's 1 month later, President Wilson asked Congress to declare war, and they obliged. Congress will declare war on Germany on April 6, 1917. Now, in order to be prepared for war, Wilson felt it really important to get the American public on their side. And so a group was formed, or groups were formed, called the Committees on Public Information. This was formed by President Wilson to help persuade the public to support the war effort. They did this by posting pamphlets and posters all over the place. They organized rallies and parades. They had guest speakers known as the 4 Minutemen, who gave short speeches in movie theaters or churches. So there was just this really emphasis and push on to get public support. Now the government did try to limit speech in some sense, because they didn't want people criticizing the war effort, so they passed 2 different acts, one called the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918, which limited free speech and allowed the government to arrest opponents to the war. Anti-war mail was prohibited and seized. Many people were jailed who were opponents of the war. Actually, one of those is still in play today. It's still in effect, called the Espionage Act. That is still a law today, where the Sedition Act is no longer a law. Now, in order to have a military, or a good military, Congress passed something called the Selective Service Act, and this was enacted in 1917 to prepare the U.S. military for war. It required men between the ages of 21 and 30 to register for a draft, and so 3 million Americans will be drafted into World War I. And this is on top of those who volunteered to fight already. A large number of the draftees were African Americans. About 400,000 African Americans served in the war, but they were not allowed to fight with white forces. And some eventually will be trained, some African Americans will be trained as officers. Preparations for war led to something called Liberty Bonds, because preparing for war is very expensive. Troops had to be trained, supplied, transported, and fed. You had to have ships and airplanes built and had to have fuel for those things. So the government had to raise taxes, and they asked the American public to maybe help finance the war by buying something called Liberty Bonds. Liberty Bonds were issued by the government to help finance Allied war efforts. A Liberty Bond is money that is essentially, you're borrowing it from the American public, and they would be able to sell those bonds back to get some money. But it did provide billions of dollars in loans. Another organization created was called the War Industries Board and the Food Administration. Both of them worked to supply the troops with materials and food supplies. So they would encourage the American public to do without some things. For example, they would have something called Meatless Mondays, where they would urge the American public not to eat meat on Mondays so that can go to the boys overseas. Or Wheatless Wednesdays. Don't eat wheat on Wednesday. That can go to the troops overseas. They encouraged many people to grow their own food at home, called victory gardens. So it was just this push to have the American public sacrifice a little bit for the men overseas. New wartime opportunities will occur for minorities in the United States. 1 million women will join the workforce. The men go off to fight. The women now can fill in the factories where the men used to work and do the men's jobs until they came back from war. About 25,000 women volunteered to serve in non-combat positions in Europe. That means serving as nurses and other, like telephone operators, signalers, typists, interpreters, over in Europe. Now, women weren't allowed to be on the front lines in combat positions, but they could serve as nurses and ambulance drivers on the front. And yet there are still some other women who protested America's involvement in the war. For example, Jane Addams, who was a very big social reformer of the time, and Jeanette Rankin were both top women of some of the top women of the United States who were against the war effort. New job opportunities encouraged Mexican Americans and African Americans to move to the northern industrial cities to, again, fill in for positions in those factories. Due to the large number of people who are coming to factories to work after the men left, union membership will increase. Workers were in a better position to demand higher wages because, labor was short. And if, like, a woman or an African American or Mexican American decided not to work because of their position, the owners would be in a tough position. They wouldn't be able to keep their factories open. So workers were in a good position to demand higher wages. More than 4 million unionized workers went on strike during the war. The National War Labor Board was established to help management and workers reach agreements with each other to limit the number of strikes. The National War Labor Board settled more than 1,000 labor disputes and worked to prevent strikes. That's the end of Section 2.